Hey everyone, welcome back to another video. So today we're going to be going into my mindset guide. Now this video is going to be a bit more conceptual in nature, just talking about mindset in general. It's a bit more just like what I think and what I've experienced rather than just like actual tangible concepts, something like the laning guide or the farming guide. This video will be split into two parts. So first I'm going to talk about the mindset you should have for like winning and playing solo queue. And the second part, I'm going to talk about the mindset you should have for improving in general. So everything will be timestamped below. And without further ado, let's get into it. So starting things off with mindset in solo queue. You guys have probably heard before that solo queue is a marathon and not a sprint, and that's absolutely true. Like solo queue climbing rank, it's going to happen over many games, potentially hundreds of games over the season, and you have a long time to do it. So in that sense, consistency is really key. You need to like reach the same level, play to the same peaks if you want to like consistently rank up. And it's also really important that you don't have that many off games. Obviously, everyone's going to have some, but it's like if you say you want to reach diamond and you're a platinum player, if you play at a diamond level, say, 5 out of every 10 games, and then 5 out of 10 games you also play like a gold player, that averages out to platinum, right? Now, if you could just bring that consistency up to that diamond level, say you play like a diamond player 7 or 8 out of 10 of those games, you're going to have much better results. I think one thing that people really like misunderstand about consistency is they think it's like a play style, whereas I think it's more like a result or an outcome. So I think if you consistently do the same things, you have strong fundamentals, you always play the game when you're focused, stuff like that, you're always going to have the same input and thus get like a very similar output. I don't think consistency really comes from play style. You might have people say, they're just people that take more risks and so just like have less consistent games overall. But I would say if their fundamentals are strong enough, they don't really become, the plays they make don't become risks, they just become calculations. There's a very big difference between doing something that is like looks risky and actually is risky, then looks risky, but someone already knows how it's going to go. So I think that's really important, because I want you guys to realize that consistency is something that's like achievable. That's like, it's like a process that you can go through, kind of reach that same level again and again. So what are some ways we can achieve this consistency? Well, I think one you've probably all heard before, but I'm going to start with anyway, is a smaller champion pool. So I think somewhere between like 1 to 4 champions is ideal. That could be either purely one tricking, it could be playing 1 or 2 champs, or it could be having like a small champion pool of 3 or 4 champions, like different options that you can pick in different games. I think like for kind of obvious reasons, if you're playing the same champions, you're playing the same matchups, building the same items over and over, just like simplifies the game a lot for you. You don't need to think about like a bunch of different stuff every time. You're not learning champions kind of as you go. You're gaining more and more knowledge on your small section of kind of the game. And I think that's really important overall. I think it can't be understated how much you just kind of learn automatically just by playing a champion over and over. You kind of naturally, you get better at the mechanics, you get better at like knowing what's going on in the game, the matchups, etc. And that allows you to kind of think and focus more on like whatever fundamental or specific concept that you're trying to work on at that time. I think even from a playing perspective, like not just from an improvement perspective, it actually makes things a lot more consistent as well. Because simply put, if you have to invest a lot of kind of like your attention or your mental APM into thinking about how to play your champion in game, naturally other things that are kind of like pretty important as well, for example, warding, watching the map, etc., just like naturally fall by the wayside. Even I think I'm a player with really strong fundamentals, but I'll freely admit that when I play a new champion, my other stuff, like my awareness and that, is not quite as strong as when I play a champion that I've played 100 or perhaps 1,000 games on. So having a smaller champion pool, really important for several reasons, and one of the best ways to just like focus on achieving that consistency. Now, the next one is having chat off or muting all. So this is perhaps a bit more controversial one, because a lot of people think that having chat on is really important, either to tell your teammates what to do or in case they communicate information during the game. I think having pings on is still reasonably useful. If people are missing pinging or backing pinging or whatever, on my way pings, there's a lot of information that's communicated by pings, which is why maybe I don't like muting all as much, but I actually highly recommend turning chat off. If anything, turn off team chat and not all chat. Like, okay, I think you can turn them both off and it's good, but if you are going to only choose one, turn off your team chat, because I think for the most part, there's a lot of toxicity in team chat, and it's very rare that it's like actually constructive. Probably the only useful thing that's communicated through like team chat is like summoner spells, like and their cooldowns and stuff, but I really don't feel like this happens that often, even in challenger rank. So I think a lot of inconsistency that people kind of have comes from like being set off from something in chat. It could be something that someone says that tilts them, or it could even just be something that someone says that, kind of makes them approach the game differently than they should. You can get baited by your teammates just like through the stuff they type and stuff. So I'm a really big fan of having chat off. I think it really does not add much to the game. If you go to your settings, I think it's like settings interface, you can actually turn like team chat and all chat off. So I highly recommend that. And I think it's like a really good way to increase your like solo queue consistency by just like kind of making it easier for you to focus on yourself and your gameplay without getting sucked into like the social mechanics essentially of solo queue. If you guys have watched Coach Curtis's videos, you probably would have heard this concept of like playing games in sets, or my take on it of just like taking 5-minute breaks. So I'll talk about them both. So the first thing is that lots of people, I think after Coach Curtis kind of made a video about it, is they play games in sets. So they might do something like they play 3 games and then they take an extended break. And the reason this is good is for several reasons. Like one, obviously you can stay focused for like a small amount of time. You can play at a very intense, very high level for that short amount of time, and then you can take a break. Another reason is that if you have tilt that kind of builds up over time, which I'm going to talk about after this, it kind of puts a stop to that. At max, you will lose games in that period of time, that 3 games or whatever you play. And after that, you can take a break and fully reset. So why do people do this? Well, for a start, it's pretty effective. A lot of the pros practice like this, not so much in solo queue, but like for scrims and stuff. Typically, the way scrims work for pro play is it's either like several blocks of 3. So you might play, 3 blocks of 3 games throughout the day, or you might play like 1 block of 5. There's various different methods to doing it, but it's very, very common. And that's kind of meant to simulate, those game day conditions where you've got like, okay, like you're going to play a best of 3 this day, you're going to play a best of 5. And obviously, even if you have best of 1s, it still helps you to kind of like play in that extended period. That being said, even the pros, like the most dedicated players, I think realize that if they play like more than 5 games at once, there is probably, a bit of a drop off at that point. I think if you've seen like series that go really long, like really long best of 5s that are going to game 5, oftentimes the game 5 gameplay is not quite as good as the game 1 gameplay. So it's very real, right? So that's one way you can do it, is to stay focused and kind of stop tilt. You can play games in sets. Way I personally do it is I just take a 5-minute break after I lose a game. So personally, I don't feel like I suffer too much with playing lots of games. To be fair, I don't play like nearly as many games as I used to when I was a current pro player, whereas now I'm more of a content creator, right? For me, just taking a 5-minute break after a loss, stopping that tilt kind of from building up immediately is really, really helpful. So what that means is literally just like headset off, don't press the queue up button for 5 minutes. I think if you like actually press queue up and it takes 5 minutes and then you get a game, it's actually not the same. Like you haven't fully like disconnected, you haven't fully like reset from that game. And that allows you to kind of like regain that same kind of intensity that you played the first game with or the previous game with, and also not take anything from the previous game, that like some emotional baggage or whatever, into that second game that might weigh you down. Now, let me elaborate on what I mean by tilt building up over time. So if you're like me, which you might not be, everyone's different when it comes to kind of the emotional side of things, I find that tilt really builds up over time for me. So what that means is that if I play like one game and a couple bad things, go wrong, something tilting happens, it's sort of whatever. But if like a bunch of bad things happen like 3 or 4 games in a row, at that point, I'll be quite tilted. And I think it's much more difficult to kind of recover once you're already like tilted than it is to just like prevent or kind of like break the cycle of being tilted in the first place. So I find that like taking a 5-minute break, like I said before, just like completely disconnecting from the game for 5 minutes after playing like a particularly tilting game or a loss or whatever, makes a really, really big difference from stopping that like residual tilt from kind of building up and getting you to the point where it's really difficult to actually play well anymore. But yeah, I really recommend kind of taking a look at yourself and kind of thinking, what does tilt you? Is it the things that people type? Is it the things people do? Is it something that builds up over time, or do you get very tilted in the game? And trying to kind of like devise a strategy for that. If you have any questions, obviously you can ask me, but I can't like answer everything specifically in this video, right? But yeah, I'm just of the opinion that most of the time tilt is something that kind of builds up, and it's much easier to prevent than it is to kind of like come back or refocus once you're already tilted. So the last one I've got here kind of needs some explaining. So I've got not giving up / focusing on the next play. Now, when I say not giving up, a lot of people probably think, okay, like, yeah, Shok's just saying every game is winnable, like never give up until the Nexus explodes. And that's not really what I'm trying to say. To be honest with you, there are plenty of games that are just completely unwinnable. Now, that being said, there's kind of 2 parts to this. First off, in Season 12, the comeback mechanics are much, much stronger than before. So from that perspective, while there are still unwinnable games, there are actually fewer fewer unwinnable games than before, and they're not as easy to identify. You know, there are plenty of games that I've played this season that I perhaps would have been ready to FF in the past that are actually winnable this season. And so I actually took a while to just focus on, you know, not pressing FF and just like kind of getting used to it. Because to be honest, you know, it used to be that if you had like a significant, you know, deficit in the early game or whatever, the amount of times you come back from that would be very, very slim. But now it's kind of the opposite. The comeback mechanics are very, very overtuned, and I'd actually say it's too easy to come back. In fact, leads don't mean as much as they used to. So what do I mean by focusing on the next play? Now, this is really, really important because a lot of people, when the game starts going bad, they give up too early. So a lot of games are winnable up until a point where they're not. Like, it's easy for me to say that, right? So I think rather than kind of focusing on is the game winnable or not, just focus on the next play. Like, okay, what do I do next? You know, focusing on what the next lane assignment is or what the next thing to farm is. Just keep focusing on the next play rather than focusing on, okay, is this game winnable or is it not? Because I think what happens is a lot of these games that are winnable, people give up too early, or rather they like focus less. They're like, okay, this game seems pretty doomed. You know, they stop focusing on the next play. And I'd say I'm guilty of this as well, you know, especially on stream when I'm focusing a little bit less. I think like I definitely don't have the same kind of just like laser focus on whatever the next play is. So what I'm just kind of trying to say here, I'm not sure if I conveyed it that well, is it's really, really important that you just, until the game is well and truly over, like not over as in the sense the Nexus blows up, but over as in there's like no way to win. It's really important that you're giving 100% up to that. I think it's super, super common that people like, okay, in the first 5 minutes, they're playing at their 100%, they see the game starts going south and they start playing at an 80%. Whereas if they had just kept focusing on the next play, they play at that 100% level, likely this game would actually be winnable, but they might not know it. You know, later in the game, say 20 minutes later, something that you did earlier in the game, you know, might make the difference. You know, it could be that extra wave you found or that extra camp gave you the gold for an item or something like that. We'll talk about that a bit more in the next section, kind of the butterfly effect of League. But yeah, just to kind of summarize this, because I feel like I really didn't make it that clear. It's really, really important that when you're in game, until the game really reaches a point where there is no recovery, that you're focusing on the next play. And you can't really spend time thinking, is the game winnable or not? Because that's time that you could be spending on the next game. I'm not saying never FF or anything like that. I'm just saying until the game is well and truly doomed, you need to play at that 100% level. Let's move on to part 2. So the mindset that you need to have for improving. If you watch my like no bullshit guide to improving a League of Legends, some of this might be familiar to you on kind of like a higher level, but I realized that I didn't go into it as much as I wanted. So in that video, I said it's really important to focus on one thing at a time, and you kind of like break that down into like a smaller concept as you can. So if you have something like laning, you might break this down into like positioning, and then you could break it down further into like you know, positioning close to wards, or positioning, you know, close to your jungler, or positioning close to like a minion to punish your opponent, right? Basically, you want to focus on one thing at a time, break it down as small as you can, and make that as easy as possible for you to kind of isolate that concept and just focus purely on that. So what I was kind of missing before in that previous explanation is what is the process, like the specific things that you need to do for improving on that one thing. So obviously it's different for every concept, but in my mind, it's like you combine a couple different things. You have VOD reviews, which you can do, and you have like gameplay, obviously, as well as like, I guess, concepts and understanding. But if we take something, you know, let's just say warding as an example. So if I wanted to improve my warding in game, I would be thinking, okay, this game, you know, I'm not going to worry too much about like winning or losing. I'm just going to focus on playing well and making sure my wards are in correct locations. Then what I would do after that is in the replay, I would just take 2 minutes, just skim through it 8 times speed or whatever, and just look at all the wards you placed and kind of think, you know, was that a good ward? Why or why not? And try to think the reasoning behind it. That's very, very important, is understanding the reasoning behind why things are good, not just copying blindly, because otherwise you will miss a lot of the kind of like important context or information. If watching your own replay, you can't get enough good ideas, just watch someone else's replay. And again, try and focus on literally just watching that one thing. So if you have a 30-minute VOD, something I see people do a lot is they just watch the whole VOD through. It's too much information to take in at once. Just, okay, I'm going to open up this VOD of Faker playing, and I'm just going to look at where he places his wards. So just, again, skim through it really fast. Just keep watching. Look at where he places his wards and try to think why. Even if you come away with something that might not necessarily be correct, like the reason you think he placed it might be different from the reason he actually placed it, is much better than just having no reason at all. You know, at least you're thinking about it and trying to get some sort of insight as to why he's doing it. So I think, again, it is different for every concept, but kind of the core process for improving on things is first, you isolate it in your gameplay. So we break it down to its smallest concept, and then we go into games trying to focus on that specific thing. Then after the game, you can either watch the replay or just think to yourself, you know, did I do it well? Like why or why not? And what could I have done better? And then if you want to take it that little extra step, you just spend literally 2 minutes, watch someone else's VOD and watch for that like key little concept, like that one thing that you're looking for. Don't worry about the entire rest of the game. And again, just think like, okay, how did they do it? Like, why did they do it? And what are they doing that I'm not? And then eventually you just kind of build up the understanding. It'll become a habit and it'll just like naturally become part of your gameplay. Another thing I quickly want to talk about is I want you guys to realize how much of a butterfly effect League has. So what that means is that small things throughout the game can affect things in a big way later on in the game. Essentially, like if you play the early game a little bit better, you might have a skirmish where you enter it with 100 HP more than if you didn't, and that could cause you to live in that skirmish, which could completely change the game, right? So that's just one example, but what I'm trying to say is that things that happen in the game affect the entire rest of the game. And the reason I want to bring that up is because a lot of people will send me a replay, or they'll talk about their game and they'll say, oh, there's no way that I could have won this game. And the reality is, in some of the situations they put themselves in, there might be no way to win those games. But the problem is that there's almost always something that can be kind of traced back, something that could have been done earlier in the game to kind of fix this position or not to get them in that position in the first place. So I just want to kind of bring that up because I think it's really important that when you're talking about which thing to focus on, improving your mistakes and concepts, that you talk about things that happen every game or that, affect the rest of the game in a big way. As I always say, it's not that useful to talk about, how to play out the perfect Elder Dragon fight, because ideally your game doesn't even go to that point. And how many Elder Dragons do you have? On average, maybe 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 games, it doesn't happen as much as talking purely about something like CSing that happens every single game. It's also really, really crucial that you try not to focus on anyone else. So I've got this written here as NPC mindset, but I think it's really important that you're just focusing on, your performance, your mistakes and your improvement. Literally the rest of your players in game are just NPCs. They don't matter to you. They're all bots. You don't need to think about them at all. Literally just focus on yourself. I just wanted to quickly throw that in here because I think a lot of people get kind of caught up in what's going on in the game, what everyone else is doing, but all you really need to focus on is yourself, playing well, not worrying too much about all the other stuff that's going on in the game. Literally just tunnel vision on yourself. And don't worry too much about the NPCs on your team. So now that I've got you focusing on your own mistakes, how do you correctly approach mistakes? Well, I think there's a two-stage approach. So the first thing is, let's say you end up in a situation, it might not be great, and it might be really hard for you to play out. There's two things that you need to consider when you're actually looking at one of your mistakes. The first thing is you need to see, okay, is there something I did that put me in this situation? So you might say, let's say you're getting ganked mid, and your first, the first thing you should look at is, okay, was this gank avoidable? Was I hugging the wrong side? Was my vision in the wrong place? Was I playing aggressively at the wrong time? That sort of stuff. Look and see if there's a root cause for why this mistake occurred. Okay, so that's stage one. Now, stage two is you need to think, okay, if I am in this situation, if I am getting ganked here, how do I best play this out? And the reason I think these things are both really important is the first stage will stop you from making these mistakes, but even at a very high level, people still do make mistakes, right? So it's really important that when this mistake does happen, that you play it to a really, really high level. And actually you will see that in especially in pro play, a lot of mistakes that kind of maybe the mistake doesn't need to happen. If the mistake is executed at such a high level, mechanically or conceptually, oftentimes it can actually work out. They can survive or they can outplay it or something like that. It's very common for people to only focus on either stage one or stage two. They might only look at, okay, how did I get in this situation? All right, I'll just fix that and stage two doesn't matter. or it might be just like, okay, I guess I could have played this better, I could have flashed, I could have done this, but then they don't think about the root cause of why that happened. So I think that's super, super important, guys. If there's actually one thing to take away from this video, I think it's that, like, really think about covering both stages of making a mistake, and I really think that's like super, super important. Next, we have try to take something away from every game that you play. So I think it's really, really common that people just queue up games over and over kind of mindlessly, like with autopilot sort of thing, and you don't really take away stuff that's actually that helpful. You might learn something kind of like mechanically or maybe just like habitually, but you don't actually like take anything away from the game that's really going to help you improve. So I think that's really important. You don't have to be like, super focused on like hyper improving at every stage of the game, making sure you're applying all the concepts perfectly and all that. But you should try just take something away from every game. It can be something small, it can be something big, it could be something for you to work on, a mistake that you commonly make. But just try take something away from every game so that no game is ever really wasted, win or lose. I think it's really easy to feel like in solo queue, a lot of games are wasted because for the most part, solo queue quality is not that high and a lot of games can feel like a waste of time. But I think if you have like the optimal improvement mindset, you can be like, okay, I either win or improve. And I take something away from every single game that I play, and that can like really just help you improve over that marathon, right? You're going to play many, many games over the season, most likely. And those are all opportunities for you to improve. Now, these last two kind of go together. So I'm going to talk about them both. So first off is the 40-20-40 rule. You've probably heard this before. This is when people say, 40% of games are, won without you pretty much. No matter what you do, you're going to win this game. And then 40% of your games are lost. Again, no matter what you do, like this game is lost, your teammates are feeding too hard, and there's not much you can do about it. And then this last 20% here that is like, you make the difference. Both sides are even. If you play well, you will win. And if you don't play well, you will lose. And one thing that you guys might realize here is that if you take 40% like win rate here, if you won all 20 of these games here, you would have a 60% win rate and you would climb pretty quick, right? So whether or not this is actually true, I'm not totally sure. I feel like the percentages could be a bit different, right? But it doesn't really matter. The point is that there are games that are outside of your control, both wins and losses. But the games you really need to like focus on are those 20% games that you really can. And you should see those games, these 40% games, as opportunities to kind of improve and practice for these 20% games. So obviously, you never kind of know like which game is which, right? Or maybe until it's over. But it's like you can get stuff out of all these games. It's not like you're playing a bunch of games only to actually like affect 20% of them. You're playing a bunch of these games, trying to improve in all of them, and that will naturally cause you to improve more and play better in these kind of 20% games. You don't need to blame yourself for every loss. It can be somewhat healthy too, from the sense that if you blame yourself, it's perhaps easier to take like something away from it. But I can only speak for myself here. But something I like really had trouble with is I would blame myself so much that it was probably like actually damaging for my mindset. It would tilt me, it would depress me, stuff like that. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't blame yourself, right? Like even if there's nothing you can do to like impact the outcome of the game, there will still be stuff in the game that you can improve on, right? So that's really important. Even though like you're not to blame for every loss, there is always something in a loss to improve on. So I just want to kind of like tell you guys that, because I think a lot of people do. They're like either in one of these two camps. They're like, okay, I blame myself for every loss. Every loss is my fault. And yeah, like there might be stuff you can do every game, but also it can lead you to just like not enjoying the game at all and just like being really depressed, right? And like, what's the point? If League isn't fun for you to play, like why are you even playing it at that point? And then there's like the opposite side where people, blame someone else for every loss, and obviously that's also unhealthy in a bunch of different ways. So that's why I think like these things can kind of be taken together. If you take something away from every game that you play, no matter if it's a 40-20 or 40 game, you don't need to blame yourself. You don't even need to worry about if it's your fault or not, as long as you're actually taking stuff away. So everyone, that's going to be it for this video. A very conceptual video, just Shok in the notepad. You guys know how it goes. I just wanted to make this because I feel like mentality is such a big part of League. The mental side of things is very, very underrated. While gameplay will always be the most important thing of the game, mentality and mindset and like processes and stuff like that, they all affect your gameplay, right? So it's like you can't really have one without considering the other because it's super, super important. So hopefully in this video, I kind of covered all the stuff that I think about solo queue and I think about improving. And if you guys have any questions about it, just let me know below. I'd be happy to clear some of this stuff up because I feel like, again, it's not something where I can just say like, okay, this is the right way to do it because, in reality, there are many different ways to improve. There are many different approaches to solo queue, and many of them are successful, right? There's a lot of different ways to do it. So this is just what I think at the end of the day. Take it with a grain of salt. Maybe you think differently, but let me know if you liked it and go ahead and like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.